Have you ever noticed how easy it is to think about faith as just an adventure with you and God? I mean, I know for myself, I can read the Bible, I can say my prayers, and I can feel so close to Jesus without ever really asking, what does my faith mean for those around me? Or am I loving my neighbors? Why is that? And what if the answer to that question isn't simply theological, it's actually historical? And that's what we're going to be exploring in this episode today. We are in the middle of a podcast series exploring Jesus' command to be a people of good works and how some Christians have come to view good works with skepticism instead. And today we're going back in time about 400 years to look at a movement called the Enlightenment. It's a moment that really deeply reshaped how Christians think about things like faith, society, and responsibility. When we last talked, we looked at the Protestant Reformation. And then in our next episode, we're going to be talking about a movement in time called the Modernist Fundamentalist Split. And I'm really excited about that upcoming conversation. But before we get there, we need to set the table and cover about 400 years of history. What happened between the Protestant Reformation and the Modernist Fundamentalist Split in the early 20th century. And so to get there, let's do a quick little recap. The Protestant Reformation fractured the medieval Christendom structures of its day, and it decentralized theological authority. And so what ended up happening was it opened up space for new conversations and new ways of thinking about society and new ways of thinking about faith. And so this broad movement that we now call the Enlightenment came about in the late 17th and into the 18th centuries. It was an intellectual movement that often emphasized things like reason, empiricism, skepticism towards things like tradition and supernatural claims. And it was often shaped by the advancements in scientific discoveries and new political ideas. Now, I'm not criticizing any of this. I am a byproduct of the Enlightenment. I am super grateful for so many aspects of it, but it is important to realize that many aspects of the Enlightenment changed and shifted how many Christians think about things like good works. So one of the fruits of the Enlightenment was something called individualism. Now, if you're not familiar with this concept, individualism is a philosophy of thinking emphasizing absolute spiritual and personal freedom. So autonomy is the big value in individualism. I have a priority for things like self-reliance, and it often gets put at an extreme. So I reject certain social structures and I reject collectivist interest in favor of my own individual desires and self-perceived truth. Now, it's unshocking to discover that this has been proven time and time again to be a worldview, a way of living that leads to self-centeredness. Now, we live in a radically individualistic culture, and it is downstream from the Enlightenment. And what has happened oftentimes in Christian circles is that this emphasis on the individual has shifted us away from more communal expressions of our faith towards a more personal expression of faith. So my own personal autonomy, potentializing my own story, and I downplay sacrificial actions of love towards others in priority towards inward belief personally. Now, there's a big problem with this for a lot of reasons, but one is that when we read the Bible as individualists, we often misread what is being said. The problem is that the scriptures were not written to individualists, they were written to people in a collectivist or a communal society. And so when we read the Bible as if it was written to us personally, it can often create big misunderstandings. So there was a book out that I highly recommend if you get a chance to read it. It's called Misreading the Scriptures Through Individualistic Eyes. And the authors say that when Westerners immersed in individualism read the Bible, it's easy to misinterpret important elements or miss them altogether. We need to recalibrate our vision. So the authors are E. Randolph Richards and Richard James, if you're interested in diving more deeply into this topic. But when it comes to good works, one of the ways we misread the scriptures through an individualistic lens is that the whole practice of faith becomes more about myself and less about a focus on what's best for my community. And so we say things like, hey, today was a good day. Even when I think about what it means to follow Jesus, I had a great day today, meaning I didn't sin, I didn't create harm, I was good today. But this is a very different vision than I did good today, meaning I helped my neighbor, I served my neighbor. And so when we read the scriptures and we practice faith individualistically, it becomes kind of about my own piety. I did good today, meaning I didn't cause harm, versus I did good today, meaning I was an agent of love in the world around me. I served my neighbor. Let me just show one example scripture of how misreading the Bible with individualistic eyes happens. Here's the text that we've been looking at all throughout this podcast series, this command of Jesus. You are the light of the world, he says in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. A city on a hill that cannot be hidden. Let your light shine before others so they may see your good deeds or your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Now, many of us, when we read this, because we read the scriptures with individualistic eyes, because we are byproducts of the Enlightenment, we read this and we think Jesus is talking to me. I am the light of the world. I am called to shine. But what we miss is that in the Greek, this word you is plural. So when he's saying you, he's talking to his family, the whole audience that would have been there that day at the Sermon on the Mount. We don't really have a good plural form of the word you in English. I live in the South, and so we get the benefit of this amazing word y'all. And so another way of kind of reading this in the original Greek would say, y'all are the light of the world. That we collectively and communally are called to be a people of good works. That this is something that we participate and support each other in pursuit of. And a private interpretation of faith will often downplay the role of communal good works. Now, that's one aspect of the Enlightenment. Another is that the Enlightenment gave us new ways of thinking about the relationship between the church and the state, new ways of thinking about governmental systems. And it's how we get to where we are right now. The Enlightenment was a huge influence on the American and French revolutions. We have our current democratic structures as a result of the Enlightenment. Now, in this whole movement, we have so many new thoughts and things that we need to wrestle through, new questions that come that need to get answered because of the Enlightenment. One is that now that people personally have a greater influence over policy, what does that mean when it comes to being a people of good works and loving our neighbor well? When the John Locke advocated in the Enlightenment for the separation between church and state, what does that mean to do that well if we're going to love our neighbor and be a people of good works? Because oftentimes what ends up happening is that the separation of church and state that we get to as a result of the Enlightenment leads to the church in some ways, quote, offloading social justice or good works to the state, where caring for the poor or the marginalized, which was once a Christian calling, now becomes a responsibility of the governmental systems around us, and we reduce the church's moral urgency and our commitment to serving the poor. Now, in my own personal theology, and it's a video for another day, I think that both the state and the church are given by God with distinct roles, and they have a vocation with which they will give an account to God for how they steward. And in the best of circumstances, there's a beautiful partnership between Christians and their governments, where we make sure that the needs of society are met, that justice, in the words of the prophet Amos, rolls like a river, that the vulnerable are protected, the marginalized are cared for. But at the worst, what ends up happening oftentimes instead is that the church, especially the modern Western church that is in democratic systems like here in the United States, can intentionally or unintentionally delegate care of the poor to the state instead of living into it as a Christian calling. Now, this is so different than the heart of Jesus. In Luke's gospel, in fact, the very first teaching that Jesus ever gives, the first words that he says after his baptism and returning from his temptation in the desert and doing war with the devil, is he opens up the scroll of Isaiah and he reads this sentence: "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor." This is the heart of Jesus. This is the heartbeat of his people. Now, we inadvertently fail to live into this heartbeat when we think that it's the responsibility of the government to care for the poor. Now, this is the first words of Jesus, and they got to be a high priority for us as his people. It's part of the reason he came. And so when we think of the church just in like the business of Christian education, and it's the government's responsibility to serve the vulnerable, we create a false dichotomy and we fail to live into the vocation of which God has given his people. So the big problem with this is, at the end of the day, a government can provide people with help, but it cannot give them hope. That is the vocation of the church. That is the role of the gospel as we both demonstrate it and we declare it to the broken world around us. Now, interestingly, if you kind of dive into this, what you see is that this split that's happened, this kind of offloading and delegating of the church's vocation to the state, it's actually led to a huge influx in parachurch ministries and nonprofit ministries. It's as if the church withdrawal from society sort of created a vacuum that needed to be filled by other organizations. And there's a really interesting book out there. I haven't read it. I've only read like certain portions of it, but it's by David Moberg. He's a sociologist of religion. And he talks about this rise of the parachurch, and it's so interesting to me. He says, when churches failed to engage structural societal needs, the parachurch arose as a corrective measure, operating as the church's workbench to meet practical expressions of the gospel. Now, that's from his book, The Church as a Social Institution. And to clarify, I love parachurch ministries. I actually led one for several years. We work incredibly close with a ministry here in our context to do justice work here in our city. So I'm not saying that this is bad. I just wonder sometimes if the church hadn't have failed to live up to its calling of being a people of good works and justice, I wonder if perhaps many of the parachurch and nonprofit ministries that had gotten started today wouldn't be in such large numbers. It really does bring up an interesting question. Are we outsourcing our responsibility for good works to other organizations, whether that be the state or nonprofits? Are we living out our command to do good works, the command of Jesus to do good works together? Interestingly, there was a response to the Enlightenment and to these problems like individualism and the new questions that we have to wrestle with in light of our new democracies. And that response came in the late 19th century and carried over into the early 20th century. And it was called the social gospel, a social movement within Protestantism that involved a little bit too of the Catholic brothers and sisters, and was aimed at applying Christian ethics towards the social problems of the day. And it had a lot of emphasis behind reforming certain institutions within the state to better meet the justice needs around it. And it really was trying to reclaim justice and good works as a Christian duty. Now, some Christian groups responded very negatively to the social gospel, and they pushed back against it, advocating for a faith that did not lean into changing society structurally, but instead promoting an emphasis on personal conversion. And that is what we're going to take a look at next week as we dive into the modernist fundamentalist split, the reaction to the reaction, if you will. The social gospel being a reaction to the Enlightenment, we're going to look at the reaction to the social gospel, and I cannot wait to have that conversation with you. Hey, before we sign off of this video, I just want to encourage you to think about maybe putting some of the stuff that we've talked about today into action. How would you maybe apply some of this? Well, one thing that you could do is that when you read the scriptures, try to answer the question of, what does this mean if I was to read it written to we instead of just me? Because so much of the New Testament in particular was written to a family. It was written to a community of brothers and sisters. And so we really do help ourselves when, as we read, we try to read it like a Southerner, throwing in the word y'all every now and then, and realizing that this isn't just written to me personally, it's written to us to communally live in together. And then if you really want to take it a step farther, why don't you just live into this calling of doing good works in a communal way? Think of something that requires you and another person to be able to accomplish in the pursuit of good works, whether it's having someone over to your house to practice hospitality, or calling up a friend and saying, hey, do you want to serve through a local nonprofit in our city? Or if maybe your church has a ministry opportunity to go and work amongst the vulnerable in your community. Let's live this stuff out together. And Lord willing, I'll be posting the next video soon. Thanks, guys. Love you. Hey, if you enjoyed that video and you have a moment, why not watch another one?